Hi, welcome to Prime Recap. A comic book nerd decides to apply the genetic material of a spider to his own body, through which he develops extraordinary and superhuman abilities. Today we will recap the story of the 2001 movie, Earth vs. the Spider. On the outskirts of the United States, Quentin lives every day in a dull and monotonous routine, living in a small apartment with his dog Thor. That morning the young man, only 23 years old, leaves for another day of work. He is a security guard at a research lab located at a university. While walking to leave the building, he meets his neighbor Stephanie, a young nurse with whom he has always been in love, but never revealed this to her. On the street, the two youngsters are stopped by a couple of hooligans who threaten them and try at all costs to intimidate them. Quentin tries to control the situation with a friendly conversation, but Stephanie takes control and confronts the two hooligans, and so she goes on her way with her friend. Quentin feels overwhelmed that he can't confront the two bullies, and even worse that his friend did it in his place. Then the two neighbors split up and go on to their respective jobs. Meanwhile, Quentin goes to a comic book store before going to work. He is a big fan of comic books. The man is fascinated by the new collectible items that arrived at the store. It was an action figure of his favorite hero, the Arachnid Avenger, and the first issue of his comic book. The protagonist befriends the salesman and thus gets a good discount to take the goods. Quentin later arrives at his job. He and his partner Nick are responsible for the security of the place. They have a very close friendship, and the old man advises Quentin about the attitudes the man should take regarding Stephanie. The duo makes several rounds throughout the day in the building, and while doing so, they observe the scientists work attentively. Through the windows they notice that several experiments involving spiders have begun to be developed in the laboratories. During the workday, Nick asks why Quentin likes to read comic books so much. After all, for him they should only be read by children. The protagonist replies that he admires his heroes, and as he reads each story he puts himself in the place of each one of them, because he tries to imagine what it would be like to have a superpower. At the end of another workday, Nick asks Quentin to make his last rounds without him. The old man did this so that he could still have a few drinks during working hours. Sometime later, the old man notices from the security cameras that a burglar has entered the building and was holding a scientist hostage. Nick acts quickly and goes to the scene. The protagonist returns to the monitoring room and while looking through the cameras realizes that his friend had been robbed by a criminal. The man immediately runs to help. Upon arriving near the room where the thief was hiding, Quentin is surprised by two policemen who have been called to control the threatening situation, but then ends up being more of a nuisance than a support. Several shots are exchanged inside the laboratory room, damaging the entire environment. After the burst of gunfire ceases, Quentin enters the scene with another police officer and realizes that everyone has been shot, including Nick, who did not survive his serious injuries. Later, Quentin is confronted by one of the policemen, saying that because the man had gotten in his way during the confrontation, his partner ended up losing his life. The man punches and kicks the man, but is quickly stopped when Detective Jack Grillo arrives. The old man says that he will need to interview Quentin about what happened, but first his mission is to find out what the thief wanted to steal from the laboratory. A few minutes later, a couple of journalists arrive on the scene to get information. One of them realizes that there was an escaped spider from the experiment room. The man acts on instinct and quickly steps on the animal. The protagonist asks the journalist not to do that, but it was already too late. To everyone's surprise, the spider that had been trampled continued walking normally as if it had not happened. Quentin is then portrayed in the newspapers as the one responsible for getting in the way of the police. He loses his job as a security guard the same day, but before he leaves, the man notices that in the crime room, a machine was working and inside it was the genetic material of a spider. The protagonist enters the scene and then applies the arachnid compound to his veins. Within seconds he begins to feel a completely strange sensation and his body begins to perform impulsive movements. Late at night, Quentin manages to get home, but is completely dazed in his bathtub, covered by several ice cubes. The next morning Stephanie misses her neighbor as she leaves her apartment, but decides to ignore it and go to work alone. The young woman returns at night and finds the newspaper article and understands what has happened to Quentin. She goes to the man's apartment and discovers that the door was not locked. Upon sneaking in, she realizes that the man's alarm clock was ringing non-stop and the place was a complete mess. Quentin's dog indicating that there was something wrong in the bathroom. Upon entering the place, she doesn't see her neighbor anywhere, but soon after, Quentin quickly appears behind her. Stephanie gets scared and says that she is worried about her friend. She realizes that the man had some injuries, so she decides to help him. In the living room, the protagonist tells his friend that from that day on, everything would be different. Stephanie finds a hole in the man's arm and deduces that there was something wrong with Quentin. However, he claims that it was just an injury he suffered while in the lab. The next day, Quentin wakes up with an uncontrollable hunger. He devours all the types of meat in his house in one meal. The man, now unemployed, goes to a nearby bar. At the scene, he notices that the policeman who assaulted him was drinking and talking to a woman. The protagonist calls the owner of the establishment to get some information, but is warned not to try to approach the man. The bartender reveals that that cop can be a huge problem for those who try to approach him. He also says that the woman standing next to him is Trixie Grillo, the wife of Detective Jack Grillo. Quentin continues to listen and finds out that a few months ago Jack participated in a mission with his partner. During the operation, his partner lost his life when confronting a thief, and Jack could do nothing about it. Since that day, his morale among the police has been at its lowest possible level, for he has been branded a coward who let his partner be eliminated before his eyes and did nothing. Just then, the detective enters the establishment and sees his wife with the policeman. He walks up to her calmly and asks her to go home. After all, he had had too much to drink. Trixie confronts him along with Officer Williams, but ends up leaving along with Jack. Quentin takes advantage of the fact that the man was already alone and goes towards him, but another woman sits at the table and disrupts all his plans. Later that night, Stephanie is walking home after a long day at work. She enters her building and goes up to her apartment. However, she was being watched by an unknown figure. The girl walks to her door, but in the middle of the way she is attacked by a thief, who tries to hurt her, but the woman kicks back and hits the criminal in the face with her keychain, wounding him superficially. Still, the thief tries to knock her out and manages to make her unconscious for a brief moment. Quentin was returning home after leaving the bar, and as he puts his hands against the wall of the building, he feels strange vibrations as if a person is struggling. The man quickly climbs the steps and finds his friend on the ground. The protagonist advances toward the thief and throws him away. After doing so, Quentin jumps out the window and hides in an alley near the building. Stephanie was barely conscious and could not observe who saved her at that moment. Minutes later, the police arrive on the scene and try to find out who was responsible for eliminating that criminal who had been wanted for so long. Stephanie reveals to the detective that she could not identify who saved her because her vision was blurred. Quentin climbs the stairs of the building, and when questioned by a policeman, he says he is a local resident. The protagonist finds his friend again and immediately tells her everything that happened that night. That same night, Quentin celebrates his first heroic act as a true superhero. He wishes in every way to resemble the Arachnid Avenger as much as possible. He realizes that his strength is extraordinary, and with it he will be able to defeat anyone. In order to protect Stephanie from all danger, he installs a hidden camera in the hallway of his apartment to monitor any threat. However, his powers had a downside. His high sensitivity to vibrations and his incredible hearing make him hear all the movements that happen in the building where he lives, from people walking, furniture being pushed, and the sound his own dog makes with its tongue. The next day, while looking through his secret camera, he notices that Stephanie was with some boxes outside the apartment. He quickly goes to her to ask what was going on. The girl says that she is organizing some things and will need to take some boxes down to the basement. Quentin makes a point of accompanying her to the site for her own safety. While they are walking, the two vandals who were hanging around in the vicinity again decide to confront the two neighbors. However, the protagonist this time demonstrates his superhuman strength. The two bullies feel threatened by being challenged like that and flee the scene. In the basement of the building, Stephanie says that her friend has completely changed, stating that he didn't seem like the same guy he was a few days ago. Quentin replies that he took action against the bullies because he is still worried about what happened the night before. He says that all people need someone to protect them from evil, at which point the protagonist decides to declare his feelings for Stephanie, but one of the boxes breaks and several comics fall to the ground. The girl feels ashamed, because this was just a memory from her past. She didn't read comics anymore. Quentin replies that those were incredible stories and she shouldn't be ashamed of it. The next day, the protagonist goes to the comic book store, and even the owner notices the strange behavior in his loyal customer. Quentin reveals that he has gained superpowers like those of a superhero, but the clerk thinks this is completely stupid. At night, the protagonist tries to eat, but realizes that no food is satisfying his hunger, and although he finds this strange, he decides to ignore the situation and go to sleep. In the middle of the night, the man wakes up suspended in his room. He notices that a web has emerged from his body and attached him to the ceiling of his apartment. Quentin finds this strange and quickly tries to get free. He makes some sudden movements and then falls to the ground, breaking in half the web that connected him to the ceiling. As he gets up, he realizes that this could be his new power. The young man concentrates and applies pressure under his body, and manages to shoot a large amount of web. The protagonist tests his new ability on the furniture in his room and even on his dog, but as he approaches Ford to let him go, he feels his dog's heartbeat, and this brings the feeling of hunger back. Quentin has no idea how to stop the unstable hunger in his body. He leaves his building bewildered and runs through the streets aimlessly. After wandering around for a long time, The man finds a market and without a second thought enters the place. Meanwhile, the market employee was arguing with a man. Quentin acts promptly, and as he approaches the alleged criminal, he throws him with superhuman force onto the market shelves, knocking him completely unconscious. The man says that the woman didn't have to worry anymore and that he was safe. However, the employee reveals that that was her boyfriend and desperately tries to call the police and ask for help. Quentin prevents her from doing so and scares the woman, who tries to flee the scene. The protagonist then performs a web shot on the employee and thereby immobilizes her on the ground. At that instant, his hands begin to undergo a frightening transformation, becoming a veritable spider claw. The man decides to go into hiding, at which point Officer Williams arrives on the scene and realizes that the store clerk is covered by a giant spider web. Quentin comes out of hiding and attacks him. The next morning Thor goes to Stephanie's apartment. She finds the dog on the doorstep and with it was a letter. Quentin wrote that his friend should take care of his dog for a while until he gets better. The woman does not understand what is happening and goes to the door of the man's apartment to try to help him in some way, but the protagonist does not answer and just watches Stephanie through his security camera while something moves inside his body. In the store where all the crime took place, the cops and Detective Jack find the body of a man who has had all his life force drained away, leaving him in a mummified state. They deduce that before losing his life, the same man was thrown into a place of incredible strength. The authorities also find several spider webs around the scene and have no idea how this connects to the crime committed. Detective Jack also finds a small brooch with Officer Williams's name on it, and asks them to run genetic tests to find out if he was at the scene. The store employee was in a panic at what she saw. The authorities are unable to question her as she only mentions a man with spider claws who was shooting webs. In light of this, the officers believe she is under the influence of illicit substances. In her apartment, Stephanie decides to try again to help her friend in some way, but he does not answer any of her calls. The man feels severe pain in his mouth, and when he goes to the bathroom to see what is going on, he realizes that his transformation is becoming increasingly bizarre. Grotesque fangs are coming out of his mouth. He feels horrible about his appearance and asks his friend to leave, because she would not understand the situation he was going through. The next day, Quentin wakes up surprised, because his fangs were not showing. He understands that he can control them, but not for long. Stephanie is in her apartment and begins to hear her friend breaking several things, shouting that he is hungry. That same night, the vandals who always created trouble in the neighborhood were in the vicinity of the condominium. They hear Quentin's voice coming from the basement. The man calls their attention with various insults. The duo is annoyed to hear this and goes to confront him, but the troublemakers were never seen walking around the neighborhood from that day on. The next morning, Detective Jack goes to the building and collects a piece of the web that was there. He takes the sample to a research lab to get more information, where he talks to one of the scientists about this creature that has tremendous strength and can produce a large amount of web. The researcher reveals that spiders possess amazing regeneration, speed, and strength. According to him, these characteristics would be very well used by other animals with a genetic fusion. However, this experiment has never been applied to humans because it would bring severe consequences. At night, Quentin goes to the comic book store to get more information. The owner of the establishment is startled by the grotesque appearance of his customer. The young man asks if there is any way to stop the Arachnid Avenger. The man replies that his only weak point is his heart, for this has become his only human part. Quentin thanks him for the information and quickly disappears into the darkness of the night. The detective decides to go to the man's apartment to get more information about this bizarre case, but gets no answer. The protagonist continues to hide in his own home and his transformation advances more and more. Detective Jack decides to inspect the basement again and this time breaks into the place. His wife Trixie was following him that day. She wishes to know what had happened to Officer Williams. Jack hears a strange voice and unexpectedly meets Officer Williams. The man says that he has not yet lost his life because of sheer luck, for the other victims had a very different fate. Jack notices that several bodies were hanging by webs and all had mummified characteristics. The detective tries to free the officer from the webs with a knife, but Williams says it is already too late. The man manages to use one of his hands, takes his gun and shoots himself. At that moment, Trixie screams for help, because something has attacked her. Jack goes up the stairs again and looks for his wife. After running for a while, he finds his wife dazed on the floor. The mysterious creature manages to escape the place through the walls and enters the building. Stephanie was arriving home. She prepares to open her door, but is surprised by a bizarre creature that was standing at the end of the hall. The monster makes a leap and comes face to face with the girl. This way she can see that it was her friend transformed into a spider, with claws and fangs coming out of his body. Stephanie screams for help as she is captured. Detective Jack goes to the building, but realizes that there is no one else there. Through one of the windows he notices a strange movement in an abandoned house. He quickly goes to the place to investigate. There he finds Stephanie trapped by several spider webs, and she begs him not to hurt Quentin. At that moment, the creature appears on the scene and asks the man to shoot him in the heart. Jack tries not to attack in any way. After all, there was still some humanity left in the man. Upon realizing this, Quentin pretends to attack Stephanie. He jumps toward her and forces the detective to shoot him numerous times. In the spider's web, Stephanie thanks Quentin for having protected her all this time. The big hero fan takes his last breath and passes away next to his beloved. Sometime later, the owner of the comic store is selling the action figure of a new character, Quentin Arachnid. So what did you think of this movie? Leave it in the comments below. And if you liked the video, please like and subscribe for more movie recaps. See you next time.